After exhausting every other option, Jessica Reznicek and Ruby Montoya decided to take matters into their own hands. In the previous months, they had helped Indigenous water protectors blockade construction, raised their voices at public hearings, participated in marches, took on hunger strikes, and locked themselves to excavation equipment, all to stop the construction of the Dakota Access Pipeline in 2016. But all of those efforts failed. So as journalist Julia Shipley reports, they began to destroy critical infrastructure along the pipeline route. For months on end, they welded valves shut and burned down essential equipment throughout Iowa. To prevent the inevitable spills and rampant emissions that would come from the Dakota Access Pipeline, Reznicek and Montoya took to sabotage. For them, it was the only route forward after all other avenues were exhausted. But they were just two people against the might of a determined fossil fuel company. So despite their campaign of infrastructural violence, the Dakota Access Pipeline started flowing. In this crucial era, where massive transformative action is necessary to stave off the worst of climate change, we need to be considering the range of tactics available to us to actually achieve that monumental change. For decades, the climate movement has been steeped in ideologies of nonviolence. Mass marches, peaceful blockades, divestment, and raising awareness. And though support is growing, we are still barreling past 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming and headed towards 2.7 degrees, which would cascade irreversible tipping points. So as the climate crisis sharpens, the question becomes, at what point do we need to escalate towards more radical acts? Today we dive into the role of property violence in the climate movement. What does that mean? Is violence justified? And what a climate movement in an increasingly hotter world might look like. This video is made possible by Ground News. Stick around to the end of this video to find out how to navigate the news with clarity and confidence. 2019 was the year of the climate movement. Millions of people who were deeply worried about the crisis took to the streets, walked out of schools, and glued themselves to tarmacs. And with these acts, pressure mounted on global leaders and fossil fuel companies. Demands from marches urged transformative change. And yet, not much happened. Politicians tipped their caps to the climate protesters with declarations of climate emergencies, and then turned around and continued subsidizing fossil fuels. Then, in early 2020, the pandemic struck and all mass gatherings were put on hold. Soon, the climate momentum that was building in the 2010s ran into a brick wall. And it seemed like the massive peaceful protests had done very little to move the needle. So activists have started to ask, at what point does the climate movement need to escalate towards property violence? But before we dive into the possibilities of a radical climate wing, we need to talk about violence. The US legal definition of violence is relatively clear-cut. It's the use, attempted use, or threatened use of physical force against the person or property of another. So violence is used to describe the immediate harm or threat of harm used by one individual to hurt a person or their property. But if we escape the confines of what the state defines as violence for a second, and consider how that term is used, things get a bit murkier. Is withholding someone's wages violence? Is letting oil leak into a waterway violence? What about divesting from neighborhoods of color and making them bear the brunt of natural disasters? And why is the same word for harming a person used to describe the destruction of capitalist property? As German playwright and poet Bertolt Brecht writes, there are many ways of killing. Stick a knife in someone's stomach, take someone's bread away, put someone in poor accommodation, work someone to death, drive someone to suicide, take someone to war. In our country, only some of this is forbidden. So violence is not only the presence of a knife in the gut, but also the absence of bread on the table or wages in the hand. And the state only seems to care about the violence of a murder or the bruises of a punch, not the systemic violence of having to live paycheck to paycheck while your employer poisons your air and your landlord forces you out onto the street. Simultaneously, the term violence is also used to delegitimize self-defense and resistance. This calls for the crucial question about whether any violence can be justified, which was exactly the question white reporters seemed to be asking in the 1970s to black revolutionaries. Instead of recognizing state and white supremacist violence against black communities in the 1970s, media attention was drawn to the perceived threat of black revolutionaries like the Black Panther Party. Scholar activist Angela Davis pushed back on this shallow view of violence during an interview by arguing that the experience of black people in America has always been defined by violence, whether slavery, police brutality, or systemic racism. So defending their community with guns from white supremacist bombings is a justified act of resistance.
When someone asks me about violence, I just I just find it incredible, because what it means is that the person who's asking that question has absolutely no idea what black people have gone through, what black people have experienced in this country since the time the first black person was kidnapped from the shores of Africa.
The purpose and context behind violence matters, which means the big question becomes, as Philosophy Tube's Abigail Thorne so eloquently asks,
how do we separate the violence that we care about from the violence that we are willing to accept or believe to be inevitable? And that's kind of what politics is for.
Depending on your politics and context, the burning down of a police station in Minneapolis, for example, could be justified or it could not be. For black folks who've experienced centuries of brutality and dispossession at the hands of cops, this could be an act of liberation. For those who see the police as a bastion of safety and security, this act of arson is unjustified violence. In short, context and politics matter when navigating the murky path of violence. Which brings us to another question. Is the continued construction and extraction of fossil fuels, which drives climate catastrophes that have killed millions, violence? Author Rebecca Solnit seems to think so when she flat out writes, "Climate change is violence." Not only is climate change violent in the physical harm of hurricanes and droughts, but as the world heats up, conflicts increase and deaths mount. In addition, as nonviolent protesters urge immediate climate action, those in power are trying to snuff out this growing discontent through murder. Over 1,700 environmental activists have been killed in the last decade. Given this context, is the violent destruction of fossil fuel infrastructure justified? Let's consider a hypothetical. If you knew that your neighbor was remotely operating a murder ring out of their house, and after talking to them, trying to stop them from leaving, pleading your local government to act, holding rallies outside their house, nothing has happened. Would you then maybe think about snipping their internet connection and destroying their computers to stop them from doing harm? Would that property violence be justified? In the same way, the destruction of the very devices that are causing climate change might be violent, but under the context of the climate crisis bearing down on us, that violence for some is justified. What's crucial to understand here is that, as Andreas Malm notes in his book How to Blow Up a Pipeline, this violence needs to be directed at infrastructure, not people. When we talk about violent escalation in the context of the climate crisis, we are talking about property destruction. If you believe that climate change is itself violent and the industrial forces fueling it are to blame, then the destruction of that property could be considered an act of justified violence, an act of resistance. But most of the climate movement, like Extinction Rebellion and Fridays for the Future, have been adamantly non-violent. They cite social movement studies and claim that any further escalation towards property destruction just hinders the movement. But as we'll soon see, the historical reality of this narrative of nonviolent movements is a little more complicated. And to understand how and why a synthesis of nonviolent and violent tactics has always been employed in social movements, we need to go back in time and deeper into the movements that are held up as bastions of nonviolent purity. Almost every movement of civil disobedience, whether the suffragettes, the civil rights movement, and anti-apartheid, has been accompanied by militant wings. Indeed, it seems that without militant escalation, those peaceful movements would have been less effective. Take the civil rights movement, for example. While Martin Luther King peacefully staged sit-ins and marches, Malcolm X and the Black Panthers took up arms to defend themselves from the police and white supremacists. Indeed, MLK himself even had guns and armed escorts at times. To white America, the perceived militancy of Malcolm X's black nationalism made Martin Luther King's nonviolence seem moderate. Indeed, Malcolm X explains this tactic clearly when he said, "I want Dr. King to know that I didn't come to Selma to make his job difficult. I really did come thinking I could make it easier. If white people realize what the alternative is, perhaps they will be more willing to hear Dr. King." This is known as the radical flank effect, the phenomenon that occurs when a more militant wing pushes the public towards accepting the mainstream movement as moderate and palatable. Whether it was the suffragettes smashing windows to drive men towards the negotiating table, or Black Panthers defending the streets with guns, making sit-ins look tame, academics have argued that escalating towards radical tactics have led to increased support of the more mainstream movement. Indeed, Andreas Malm argues that the narrative that nonviolence has led to the success of movements is sanitized history. Gandhi sought multiple times to fight in British wars to prove Indian manliness and achieve independence. while Nelson Mandela organized a militant wing that complemented divestment and nonviolent campaigns to end South African apartheid. A wing that sought to hamper the military effectiveness of the state through selective forays against military installations, power plants, telephone lines, and transportation links. The lesson from past movements is not that nonviolent tactics are ineffective, but instead that when those tactics stall in their progress, a more militant appendage has employed strategic property destruction to pile on pressure. As emissions continue to ramp up and the world warms, activists are now starting to call for these more drastic measures to halt the use of any CO2 emitting devices. Indeed, Malm calls for the emergence of a radical arm of the climate movement focused on the sabotage of fossil fuel infrastructure. In his view, the ruling classes really will not be talked into action. They are not amenable to persuasion. The louder the sirens wail, the more material they rush to the fire. And so it is evident that the change will have to be forced upon them. In Malm's opinion, the climate radical flank would force that change through sabotage of fossil capital. This flank would directly attack the only thing the fossil fuel industry pays attention to: profit and the bottom line. The goal would be to make any investment in new carbon dioxide infrastructure too risky, and there already seems to be strains of this radical climate flank popping up across the world, with Jessica Reznicek and Ruby Montoya being just one example. But with these radical flanks, there is also mounting backlash, as fossil capital and the state try to quash what they see as unjustified violence threatening their property and profits. By October of 1998, the Earth Liberation Front was at war. Determined to make those who were destroying the planet pay for their acts, activists across the country who already burned down a logging headquarters, cut power lines, set fire to a wild horse capture station, now had their sights set on the Two Elk Lodge ski resort in Colorado. According to the New York Times, the managers of the hotel wanted to clear 800 acres of forest for new slopes and roads, an act which threatened the habitat of the Canadian lynx. And after environmental groups like the Sierra Club failed to contest the resort expansion in the courts, members of the Earth Liberation Front, or ELF, took matters into their own hands. They set fire to 8 buildings and ski lifts, causing $12 million in damages. Later, when the front claimed responsibility for the ski resort arson, they vehemently claimed that putting profits ahead of Colorado's wildlife will not be tolerated. These acts of destruction for ecological protection continued on into the early 2000s. All told, the Earth Liberation Front, Animal Liberation Front, Earth First, and all of their splinter groups claimed 27,100 actions between 1973 and 2010. And throughout every arson and sabotage, no one was killed. But in 2001, the Earth Liberation Front was thrust into the limelight. 2 planes hit the World Trade Center, and 2 others struck the Pentagon and the fields of Pennsylvania. The logging, fur, and animal industries seized the newfound fear of terrorism to lobby for the eradication of what they called eco-terrorists. Quickly, the FBI was sent to hound down the underground activists that comprised the Earth Liberation Front, and eco-terrorism became the #1 domestic terror threat in the eyes of the FBI. The agents of the EFL and the AFL were rounded up and imprisoned or forced to flee the country. EFL was quickly dissolved. The rise and fall of the Earth Liberation Front reveals the reality of sabotage. Andreas Malm argues that the Earth Liberation Front failed because there was not a parallel mass nonviolent movement at the time. He writes that all of those thousands of monkey-wrenching actions were not performed in a dynamic relation to a mass movement, but largely in a void. As a result, the ELF was seen as less of a radical flank and more as an extreme actor, and failed as a result. I would also add that the state and industry backlash against these direct action groups, which was so immense post 9/11 that it was deemed the Green Scare, was almost impossible to recover from. The ELF showed that when you strike at the assets and profit of industry, they will mobilize their power together with the state to eradicate your movement. And despite the lack of any prevalent eco-sabotage campaigns today, we're beginning to see glimpses of how fossil capital will wield state power to protect their interests. In Australia, lawmakers passed a bill last April that increased the fine for protesters charged with blocking economic activity from $400 to $15,000 and up to 2 years of jail time. In Britain, members of parliament introduced a public order bill, which if passed would hand police the power to stop and search protesters, as well as create 6-month jail sentences for protesters who lock themselves to infrastructure. In the US, 17 states passed anti-protest laws in the last 5 years, with some handing out 10-year prison sentences and up to $1 million fines for tampering with fossil fuel infrastructure. And in Brazil, the state under Bolsonaro flat out murdered rainforest protectors and environmental activists. All over the world, direct climate action, not even eco-sabotage, is already igniting authoritarian reactions from states influenced by fossil capital. The fate of Jessica Resnicek and Ruby Montoya reveals this mounting backlash in harsh light. After their campaign of fossil fuel property destruction, the two activists gave themselves up to the authorities and were sentenced to 6 years of prison and made to pay over $3 million in damages. A sentence that surely pleased the Dakota Access Pipeline executive who said this about Resnicek and Montoya in the midst of their sabotage campaign.
You're talking about somebody that needs to be removed from the gene pool.
It's clear that when the public starts taking matters into their own hands, non-violently, and especially through violent property destruction, fossil capitalists will not just lay over and take it. They will wield their influence over the state to squash any disturbance to their bottom line. And it seems that as the climate crisis grows worse, the fossil fuel industry will react strongly regardless of non-violent or violent approaches. Going forward then, what purpose does a radical climate wing serve in a broader climate movement? Looking towards a future where fossil fuel capitalism continues to emit without consequences, it seems like it's escalation or climate chaos. But the role of eco-sabotage is never to harm people or end lives. It's to strike fossil fuel capitalism where it hurts: fixed assets and production. As the Earth Liberation Front shows, this sabotage cannot exist without a broader anti-capitalist movement that is out on the streets non-violently protesting and campaigning. If the radical climate flank is to be seen as anything, it should be seen as a last resort that acts as an appendage to the bigger peaceful mass movement, one that puts even more pressure on governments to sit down at the table with climate activists and actually end the use of fossil fuels and transition to a zero-carbon world. But again, property destruction is only necessary when we have exhausted all other options. It should always be a last resort. Because as I've said again and again, context and the manner in which these radical acts take place is important to the success of the movement. There's a large difference between throwing soup on a piece of art and welding a pipeline valve shut. One seeks to raise awareness about the climate crisis, while the other directly attacks the fossil fuel industry's bottom line. Both might fuel broader climate action and might draw different people to the cause. The key is that these diverse tactics need to be generally moving in the same direction: the abolition of fossil fuels in a way that doesn't directly harm people. At the end of the day, property damage and eco-sabotage are acts of destruction, ones that attempt to rip the fate of the world away from the hands of fossil capitalists by burning, smashing, and liquidating CO2-emitting infrastructure. But as much as the abolition of fossil fuels is necessary, the climate movement needs an equal, if not more, amount of appendages that dream and build a future that's emissions-free, liberatory, and just. It's so important to envision post-fossil capitalist utopias, ones that give purpose to destructive sabotage. Beautiful visions that show that the violence of fossil capital doesn't have to be forever. And I'm going to cover some of these beautiful visions of an ecological future in my video coming out next month. But if you don't want to wait, I've released that video today on Nebula. In the meantime, we also need to stay informed about what's going on in the world right now. Like the fact that Antarctic sea ice is at a record low, or the Biden administration just proposed a new coal wastewater rule. And one of the best ways to stay up to date with current events is ground news. I've been using ground news for a long time and really appreciate how clear and simple it makes reading the news. Ground News is a website and app that collects over 50,000 media sources into one place and lets you compare how headlines are being covered across the political spectrum. This is crucial for not only understanding exactly how current events are being covered, but it also helps build your media analysis skills along the way, so that when you do encounter a media source in the wild, you know their biases and tendencies. Because Ground News makes it easy to decipher what's really going on by providing bias, factuality, and ownership ratings for each source. For literally any story, like this one on the recent coal wastewater rule proposal in the US, I can look at how many sources are reporting it, as well as the political leaning of those that are covering the event. I can also check how reliable all of those sources are, and even who owns them. And when that's not enough, Ground News allows you to do side-by-side comparisons of headlines to understand how different media organizations are portraying the issue. And they even have a handy blind spot tool to help you discover stories that you might never have seen. For anyone who wants to stay up to date on the headlines around the world, Ground News is an extremely powerful tool for navigating the news. I quite literally use it every day. For anyone who wants to stay up to date on the headlines of the world, Ground News is essential. So if you want more clarity in your news, head to ground.news/OCC or click the link in the description and subscribe to make media a whole lot more transparent in your everyday life. Otherwise, consider watching another OCC video on the threat of fossil fascism, or support me on Nebula by clicking the link on screen right now. And that's it. I'll see you next month.